All right, good morning, guys. Good morning, Aaron and Britt and T and Holly. Hopefully we'll get a couple more coming on here in the next few minutes as well. Let me start out like this. I think you've already seen that I've sent a message with the stuff that we have coming up this week. So let me go over what I have to follow up on from last week. Scoring wise, there's a rewrite possibility if anyone would like to take advantage of that. And I'll show you how you can go about that as well. We're starting this week chapter 3. So this is a new section. This is on culture. Today we're going to be doing one break room, or if the numbers aren't enough, I'll just like set aside some time rather than put people in groups. But I have a question that I want us to think about together. And then on Wednesday, I have 2 break room sessions on, and one of them requires that people read an article. So let me begin just going up and showing you what we have here coming up. So this is the 3rd week here. So the summary of week tasks, you should have seen this already for Wednesday. You guys will be reading this article called Shakespeare in the Bush. Shakespeare in the Bush is about a group called the TIV. And I'll show you just a little bit of background about the TIV, enough so that the reading means something more to you. And we're going to use this reading for our discussion on Wednesday, which is going to be about the twin concepts of A, ethnocentrism, B, cultural relativism. There are 2 concepts that are best spoken about at the same time. So you read that. Let me just show you, if I bring, here it is. Now, for this one, let's see, read the article Shakespeare in the Bush. Let me just make sure that you're able to, okay, here it is. Okay, so here's the PDF of that. Okay, everything's there. I think it's a very entertaining little story about this group, and this group that we're going to be talking about is in Africa. It's in Nigeria. It's from about half a century ago, but the group is still very much alive, thriving, much more populated than it was at the time. Okay, so you read that, and then let me double check, see if there's a yeah, let me take a look once again what we have here. Oh yeah, so these questions here, what I would like you to do for, let me see, is this, let me double check, 10 points. Yeah, so you actually answer questions based on this reading, these questions down here. What it is it's an ethnographer's story. High chance. This person goes to Nigeria to study this group. Actually, it's a husband and wife team. And the person who's writing it is telling a story about when she got together with leaders, recognized leaders of the group, and they like to tell stories. In fact, it's almost seen as being a quality of a leader to be a good storyteller. And they kind of see her as a representative of her group. So they ask her for a story. She's like, I'm not very good at telling stories, but what she says is, why don't I borrow the story of one of our great storytellers from our culture, which is William Shakespeare. And the story she tells them is the story of Hamlet, right? And so what I do is I provide just a little bit of a synopsis about what happens in Hamlet. Okay, it's the story of a king who's been scandalously murdered. Okay, and the brother of the king is behind the murder, and the brother marries right off the bat as soon as the king is murdered, the king's wife, and that's supposed to be a scandal to the readers. Okay, and you're supposed to understand something about this concept, ethnocentrism and cultural relativism, based on how the people who are hearing this story react. Okay, so I provide a little bit of a background in this essay. The ethnographer tells the story of Hamlet, and then I just tell you a little bit of the plot line of that. Okay, so you will enjoy that, and we're going to base our discussion on your having read that. Now, what's the next thing we have here? Then we have homework on culture. So this is just a run through your textbook, find the definitions, the phrases, write down a little what you find there. So this is a completion exercise. This is also due on Wednesday as well. So we're a little heavier in terms of work this third week, as I kind of led you to expect. Okay, so we got 3 things I want that will be due then. So Shakespeare in the Bush, homework on culture. That won't take very long. It's not a laborious exercise. Right? Just find the terms. And then I also want you to fill in, let's see, so where's that? Shakespeare in the Bush topic. You'll be responding to this. You'll need to complete this. It'll be on the basis of a discussion that we have today regarding the effect of language, what we all think about the effect of language on thought, perception, cognition in general. Okay, what does language have to do with all that kind of stuff, the particular language we happen to know or speak? Let's see, then actually the rest of the week, and I'll tell you this on Wednesday. I'll wait till Wednesday to talk about the other things. There will be a second quiz it'll be focused exclusively on this chapter. This is chapter 3 in your textbook. There will also be the second discussion contribution will be about ethnocentrism. Okay, which, if you haven't heard the word before, I'm guessing many have. This will be a central idea that we're going to discuss. Okay, now regarding the stuff that you guys did last week, so I will be grading the quizzes. I will be there's also the thing about poverty that you did last week, also the documentary response. So I'll be covering that stuff this week. And then as far as the C. Wright Mills, so I got through everybody's. I got you guys' feedback on that. And what you can do, if you want to, if it's appropriate, you can do a rewrite based on my feedback. And then also I've provided this. If you see this little thing here, C. Wright Mills, Simplified Scheme for Rewrite Assistance. And what is if you open it up, it's another little video in which what I do is I use this little scheme that I have myself, a little document, and I talk about how I understand C. Wright Mills and what this distinction between troubles and issues really means. In some ways, it's an easy distinction to get, like troubles is for personal thing, the way you experience things personally. Issues is this wider kind of, whole look at society and how, the factors in society, institutions, politics, economics, and so on, can serve as kind of the structures that affect people's personal experiences. Some of you, I mean, there was some really good responses to that. But if you want to get a clear idea of what I think he's saying, you can watch this video. It says, in Erica, I'm sure it's fine. Okay, and you can complete that. All you have to do is resubmit. Submit a new file, and then let's say you got a 12 or an 11 or whatever it happened to be, you can try to get it up closer to 15. Okay, let's see here. I think that pretty much covers it as far as what we're up to this week. Let me do this. I'm going to lead into our discussion about language by first talking about this group called the TIV. Let me show you the PowerPoint that I use to go along with this chapter. So we're talking about culture. Here's some of the major themes that we'll be discussing. This actually, the quiz 2 topics, you can take a look at that to get an idea of the kind of things that are going to be required for you to know on, say, the quiz coming up here. With the exception, I don't think we're going to discuss this. I haven't decided 100%. We'll see. We'll see. What else? Yeah, the biocultural approach. This we're talking about today, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. That's the name for this idea about the effect of language on thought. Definition of culture. Here's another concept, cultural lag, which is about culture change, how cultures change over time through diffusion, invention, discovery, cultural lag. These are all about, you know, the ways in which over time cultures can alter, evolve, add in elements, leave out elements, and so forth. Definition of culture. We'll get to that in a second. What I do, though, is I use one particular group, this group called the TIV. So let me talk to basically be an inroad to discussing culture in general. So let me start here by giving you a little background about the TIV. The TIV are the group that Laura Bohannon writes about in her little essay called Shakespeare in the Bush, which is about ethnocentrism, cultural relativism. So let me do this. Let me move to, you know what I want to do with this really quick. I'm going to duplicate that slide, and I'm going to see if I can take away all of these guys right here. Cut that and cut that, because I want to peel this away to show you where we are in the world. Where we are in the world is Africa, West Africa in particular, sort of towards the north, right? Below the Saharan desert. So if you think of Africa, it would go all the way up here and then it'd go down here. Here'd be the Atlantic Ocean. And this whole area right here is Nigeria. Back in 1958, this is based on an article. What I have here is based on an article written by the Laura and Paul Bohannon husband and wife team, who, in order to explore some stuff about the economic practices of this particular group, they're over here, the TIV, in this brown right here. That's the name of the group. So when you write about the TIV, if I ask you to write about the TIV, the way it's typically done, the convention is to say the TIV, okay? And that's both the singular and the plural. So you could say a TIV individual, a TIV baby, the TIV in general. And then you can see there's other larger group, there's other large groups as well. It turns out there's, in Nigeria today, there's well over 200 recognized ethnic groups, groups who self-identify according to a particular name, like the TIV, the Jukun, the Igbo, the Yoruba. The Yoruba is probably the second largest ethnic group in Nigeria today. The Hausa and Fulani up in the north here. I'll just make a really broadly, just a couple things about this area that pertains to today. Largely, the group is, there's two major religious groups. Most groups actually retain sort of their traditional indigenous system of beliefs in gods and spirits and this, that, and the other kind of thing, and powers. At the same time as they're also members, they've also are members of churches belonging to these big, larger families of religion. So Muslim or Islam in the north, like groups like the Hausa and the Fulani. In the south, like the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Idu, and so on, that's where you find Christian groups. Now, there has been, if anybody's ever heard of this group called Boko Haram, if I'm getting their name correctly, they're one of these groups that's been fingered as kind of a terrorist organization by some. Okay, that they kind of traffic in violence in a kind of struggle between different groups. So there has been tensions, but there has also been harmonious. So it's been a kind of a mixed bag, both harmonious and tense relationships between these two major groups. This one, Muslims mostly from the north, among the Hausa and the Fulani. The Hausa are the biggest ethnic group in the country. Okay, and these groups from the south, and historically the Hausa lived in drier areas, and they herded but cattle, had horses. They tended to be merchants. They wandered around and traded goods. They moved into the south, back from the north, and so on, bringing goods and trading and exchanging and the like. And there's more in the fertile areas in the south. These are kind of delta areas along the coastline. You find more agriculture. The Tiv themselves are historically very relatively well-to-do, successful farmers. Let's see what else about major background. Just one of the things that'll come into play later on is in terms of broad lines of history. Nigeria as a country, and so including all these groups that are to be found in Nigeria today, back in about, let's say, 1900. I don't remember the exact date, but it's pretty close to about 1900. This Nigeria became part of the Victorian Empire. That is, they were colonized by England. So they were under the control of England. England exercised control there. It was called indirect control. What that largely meant is after you've militarily gained control over an area, what you did is you kind of recruited locals. And you said, you guys are going to be an official arm of the empire. You'll answer to us, but you'll kind of be a go-between between us and your own local group. So they exercised indirect rule, and they would have had these different administrative areas for their different ethnic groups, largely like Tiv would have been called Tivland. Okay, and there would have been a chief. The British would have recognized a particular individual that would have gone between the people, the Tiv themselves, and the British. Okay, so the British were there, just as other European groups were Africa was largely under control of many European groups for a good long period of time. And then after World War II, there was this period of decolonization where France, England, Germany before then, and you name it, Portugal, Spain, and so on, kind of relinquished control of their previous colonial territories, and Nigeria became its own independent free country in the early 1960s. maybe 63 thereabouts. So just remember that. Keep that in mind, that in its past, there is this history of British rule. I'll have a little bit more to say about that on Wednesday. We're going to be doing an exercise where we talk about manifest and latent functions once again, and it's going to have to, this fact about their history is going to become relevant then. All right. Let's see, what else do I want to say about them? About the TIV themselves, what do I want to say? So the TIV, as the Bohannons pointed out, they were always very successful farmers. They grew lots of grain. The grains were like kind of wheat-like. Sorghum is what they grew. Lots of sorghum. They grew other things as well, and they had gardens like every single. So if you see a typical kind of conical thatch hut of the kind that's found through much of Africa, is found here as well. And so on the ground, what would you see? You'd see a bunch of huts kind of huddled all together, and there'd be like these clumps or clusters of huts, and they would be usually linked together by family, by kinship, and I'll talk about that in just a little second as well. And it would be kind of headed up by a male, and wife or wives and children next to related kin. They'd have gardens, and they'd grow tomatoes and squash and onions and other things. So they would have these fields, they'd have their gardens, they'd have poultry. So they'd have like chickens wandering around. They may have they may have a goat or two and some cattle. Okay, but they weren't cattle herders. Like, so they may have 1 or 2 heads of cattle, but that would be it. They didn't rely on the cattle for their food or other resources, but the cattle would sometimes fulfill some kind of symbolic role. Okay, so one of the things about the TIV is the TIV, unlike many groups in Nigeria, like many groups in Africa, actually embraced Christianity, kind of readily incorporated Christianity, and combined it, melded it with their own kind of pre-existing local beliefs. Now, the TIV were kind of renowned as a group that didn't seem to be interested. They had no interest. The missionaries came around, told their story, told their story about Christianity, and the TIV remained, okay, as the word that would have been used more often at the time was pagan, and that simply means, for our purposes, non-Christian, non-believers in what the missionaries had to say. So they kind of, held off and retained their own beliefs at the time. Okay, so they're known for being prosperous subsistence farmers. Subsistence farmers, when you talk about subsistence agriculturalists, it means they're growing mostly to feed themselves rather than to make money by selling their produce. Okay, and that would actually change. That would be one of the things that the British would try to change. Now, what else about them? Look, they're a fairly sizable group. I should mention that Nigeria itself is, I think by a good deal, the largest, the most populated country in Africa. I just checked, and it looks like as of 2020, they're well over 200,000. And just a few years ago, it was, I had to change my numbers. It was 170. So they are a quickly growing country. They're a young country. So average age is going to be a lot lower than, say, the United States, which itself isn't that aged of a country. So they have still a fairly high birth rate, like a so-called developing country might. I should mention too that they actually are experiencing pretty strong economic growth, like a percentage that's several times what the US is, right? So they're actually growing, their economy is growing quite a bit. A lot of that growth is based on oil. So if I go back to if I go back, if I can go back, I go back here off of this coast right here, this delta area. Okay, offshore, you've had these oil companies like Dutch Shell Oil. They're the only ones I'm aware of. It could be that there's others also. They've had a presence there, and they found oil reserves. It turns out Nigeria's pretty high in the ranks of like the amount of oil reserves that's within its territory. So it's been a huge portion of its overall wealth as a country is, I think, close to half of it almost is from oil wealth. As a result of that, there's been a lot of tensions and conflicts between different ethnic groups regarding who benefits or not, who has control or not over the different oil fields, right? So, and in fact, one of the things that we're going to be talking about on Wednesday is a belief in what we would call witchcraft and witchcraft accusation, witch hunts, and so on. And that's actually something that's popped up as perhaps a tool or a side effect of this conflict regarding the distribution of oil wealth. Okay, so keep that in mind. Beliefs regarding things like witchcraft and so on has not disappeared from the face of the earth, and in many areas of sub-Saharan Africa, it's still very much alive. Areas of New Guinea, areas of the Amazonian, South America, and so on. It's still an issue, and so we'll actually discuss that now. So when you read that article about Shakespeare in the Bush, a little bit of some stuff here that I'll mention really quickly that maybe you'll recognize about their social organization. The Bohannans, when they did participant observations, living for several years among the Tiv, getting to know them personally, observe them firsthand, learn their language and the like. They learned about how they were organized socially. They learned about what they believed in, okay? How they believe the world works, how they believe people get ill, die, what causes things to come into existence and pass away, and so forth. They also learned about how their economic system is structured. And for our purposes today, just a little bit of preparation for your reading, they are organized as what's called a patrilineal group. So let me explain really quickly what this means. Let me get rid of these. This stuff here. Okay, this chart right here, if you, Britt, Chance, T, Holly, you guys, Aaron, put yourself in here, a female is a circle, a male is a triangle. If there's something connecting you up, you've been married, okay, these would be children. This would circle a daughter, okay, a son, a triangle. Okay, so here's how it works. If you are this ego right here, let's say you're male, you have a brother and a sister, and you're all shaded in the same color to indicate that you come from the same family. So Tiv social organization is in terms of kinship or family groups, and you receive your kinship membership from dad, from the father, from the male line. Okay, so it's inherited. So all siblings, your brothers, your sisters, are all going to be of the same family, and that family is through the father. Your mother, you don't inherit your mother's family membership. Your mother belongs to a different family. Okay, so now imagine that the way it works here. Okay, let me see. You are brother, okay, let's see, mother, father, and they've had you, and you have a sister. And your sister, let's say when she's 18, she gets married to some guy and she has children. Those children will belong not to her family, but to her husband's family, right? Just as your own mother will actually belong, okay, officially to another family. So this is different. This is different from the way that we all do family in this part of the world. So how do we do family? One of the things I want to do here in this culture, we're talking about culture, is we talk about cultural variation, diversity of life ways, of dietary ways, of how we do family, of how we do marriage, of what we can believe in, of how we can run an economy. All the different ways of living display a pretty impressive diversity in the human species. So this is kind of I come from anthropology, one of the big sort of eternal takeaways from anthropological investigation is human beings are paradoxical in the following sense. We're incredibly uniform biologically. There's not an impressive amount of biological diversity, okay? And this is probably because we're a fairly young population, okay? So pretty much human beings are the same wherever we go in the fundamentals. There's just not much biological diversity in all the ways that you measure that kind of thing. However, and likely because of our capacity for culture based on symbolic forms of communication or information processing, which we'll talk about in a second, probably because of that, we exhibit incredible diversity in terms of the ways in which we can adapt, the ways in which we can create new ways of life, ways of doing family, marrying, eating, wearing clothes, doing art, coming up with laws, you name it. Okay, so incredible uniformity and diversity at the same time. Okay, now, so coming back to the family, here's how we do family in our part of the world for the most part. For the most part, okay? There's diversity within our own culture in terms of family. So here's a male. Okay, any of the males in this group here this morning, if you get married and you have children, the way it works is you guys are all part of the same family. You come together from different families and you form a new family. So, and this, at least in this part of the world, ideally, at some point in your life, you'll probably live in your own independent new, domicile, house, apartment, wherever it happens to be. So, and that's called neo-local, where you live. Okay, so you form your own family unit. In this other kind of society we're talking about, which is patrilineal. Okay, and a patrilineal, patra means father, lineal means down the line from generation to generation. Okay, there are other cultures which are matrilineal, the same thing as patrilineal, but it's through the mother's line. And the deal is, here it's different. Basically, the woman forms a new family, but in these other societies, when the woman forms a new family, a Tiv woman, what she does is she gets married and then she moves in with the husband who's living among his natal group, the group he grew up with. Okay, so he's living with fathers and mothers, their children, with his brothers and their wives and so forth. So the woman basically moves from her family into this foreign territory, essentially, right? And it turns out, at least in some patrilineal societies, this can be pretty rough, okay? You're leaving the warmth and comforts and familiarities and attachments of your own place. You come into this new house, this new place, okay? And people kind of treat you as this newcomer, as this foreigner, as somebody, and they may be a little suspicious of you. They may wonder if you still left your heart back with your family, or you're willing to throw in your everything with this new group. Okay, so I put down here, married women leave their own kin group, including in a psychological sense. It can be kind of tough. Okay, now, so that's how they're organized in terms of their social organization. One other thing is that traditionally, and when I say traditionally, I mean largely before they were colonized, Tiv society did not have any official leadership. So the British come in and they say to some guy who may have a name like Umbakor or something like that, you're going to be the chief, and you're going to be a chief for as long you're going to hold your chiefly tenure the rest of your life, because we want to deal with the same person, know who we're dealing with, et cetera, et cetera. Before then, there were no such thing as permanent chiefs. There was no official political leadership. There was no centralized political institutions, by which I mean there were no elected officials, there was no hereditary kings, there were no officials, like say judicial officials, like an elected or lifetime judge, any other kind of law giver or law enforcer of that kind. What there were these informal, recognized, informal leaders who were males. They tended to be elder males who, over the course of their lifetime, had earned a name for themselves as just, level-headed. Maybe they were wise. They had certain characteristics that made them good leaders that people looked up to and they followed and they came to for advice. Okay, and the Bohannans, the referred to them as compound heads, the heads of a compound. Okay, and in fact, one thing I wanted to point out here is that the Tiv were traditionally very egalitarian. Okay, the word egalitarian means equality preferring. So that, in fact, and I want you to keep this in mind for when we talk on Wednesday, they're equality preferring. If there would be some Tiv who kind of let things get to his head, right? He's gathering a following. People are always coming to him to resolve a dispute, to settle a fight. Somebody steals a chicken from somebody else and they go to this other guy, and pretty soon this other guy is thinking, you know what? I might as well be like the permanent leader around here. Once people start seeing that, they react to it negatively, sometimes even violently, right? They do not like other Tiv thinking that they are, boss of them. And so you can think of it this way. The way I think of it is that traditionally, Tiv society liked to maintain a level playing field, with all people maintaining official equality in terms of influence and power over other Tiv. Once you had one or a few people sort of rising in terms of power and influence, what would happen is there'd be this kind of reaction by the other Tiv. They would speak badly about this person, gossip about him, or they would go to other Tiv. Okay, they would defect, they would leave, they would seek advice elsewhere. They would do what it took to send the message back to this guy that we're knocking you back down. You're just the same as the rest of them. Okay? So that would be a form of egalitarianism. I want you to keep that dynamic in mind, okay, for when we discuss. Yeah, go ahead, T, please. I've been talking the whole time, and yeah, so I'm happy
I'm
to hear
just
somebody.
curious about something.
Please.
So you said that their approach was equality preferring, right?
Yeah.
But the way you've described this society, it doesn't sound like it's equal for every person. It sounds like it's equal for every man.
Yeah.
So how is it that you are to differentiate between those different like types of equality? Because I mean, as far as it seems, these women have really no say in anything. So I'm wondering, what's the divide between like this? Am I making sense? I don't really know how to.
You're making perfect sense. And in fact, that's a good thing to point out, because how do you describe it? You describe it exactly as you stated. Okay. So there is, and usually so you're probably correct to say that when people point to societies like the TIV and describe them as egalitarian, they kind of mean, in parentheses, except the females. That's kind of what they mean, which of course means that that's not a very inclusive sense of egalitarian. Absolutely, absolutely. So now I will say this. I mean, we could have, I would love to be able to have a semester where we talked about different forms of political organizations among groups. It turns out that the closest thing that we get to gender parity that approaches anything close to what we see in modern democratic societies is among hunter-gatherers. These guys aren't hunter-gatherers, they're growing stuff. Hunter-gatherers don't grow stuff. But it's among hunter-gatherers that you see something closer to equality in terms of rights and influence of the sort that modern democratic societies are just beginning to approximate. So yeah, very good. We ought to make that exception. One thing I did want to point out is that even though it's going to seem like females are all but voiceless, like they don't have a voice, and all but powerless, all the decisions are being made by others, it turns out that a lot of sub-Saharan African groups, even though they're different from other groups that have a patrilineal organization, like many in the Near East, like in the Middle East or in India, for example, the women there are actually more independent and have more power, relatively speaking, for the reason that their own labor contributions are much stronger. So this kind of leads me off to another thing, but so this group I said is they're doing a lot of agriculture. Turns out that the backbone of their field labor are females. The females do the bulk of the farming. And so the group relies on female labor. And since they rely on female labor, also females often have their own little plot of land that they get to work themselves and possess, which means that they're able to sort of gain a kind of economic independence that you may not see in other groups with this kind of kinship organization. Plus, when it comes to marriage, so they have arranged marriages, something like an arranged marriage, but the female herself often is successfully able to get her own preferences addressed. Even though officially it's going to be a male that like agrees with the other family. So it's like if you're a brother, you're often in charge of getting your sister married. So you got to go talk to another group and say, hey, my sister is, marriageable age, et cetera, et cetera. And so officially you're the one who like arranges the marriage. But the sister is like very often able to say, not a chance. I'm not marrying that guy. No, no way. He's lazy. I don't like how he looks. I don't like how he talks, and so on. Okay. So very often, in order for the arranged marriage to go through, it has to have the support of the person herself. But yes, so it's an incomplete egalitarian. It's a non-gender egalitarianism. Is that filling in what the kind of information you were looking for, T?
I'm sorry, I'm having computer troubles. Yes,
Oh, okay.
It was what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just didn't understand, because like even from what you were explaining, I think the more you explain it, it'll make more sense. But it still feels like, even though women have these sort of, I don't want to say incentives, more like benefits, I guess, it still sounds like they do most of the work.
Yeah.
Which I guess is their power.
It's both, it's kind of like, so it's complicated. Here's what I'm hearing you kind of wondering. I'm hearing that, are they exploited or are they independent? Right? Are they being taken advantage of? Because I would say actually both. It can work both ways. Okay. But in fact, in Nigeria in general, Nigerian females are renowned for being players in the market, like in the open market. So being entrepreneurs, in fact, that they tend to be the ones who are most active economically, at least in the marketplace, at least in an urban, especially in an urban context. And I'm just thinking in terms of like groups that have this kind of kinship organization, which I should mention is much commoner than matrilineal groups, where you get your family membership from the male than from the female. Okay, but it's all around the world. You find patrilineal, at least historically, both patrilineal and matrilineal kinship systems throughout the world. The kind of kinship system that we have, just in terms of sheer numbers, it's become more and more pervasive, and it shares a little bit with like hunter-gatherers as well, it turns out, with many hunter-gatherer groups. But without getting into that too much, so you're absolutely right. There's, in terms of gender relations, to call this group egalitarian is to overlook or de-emphasize their gender relations. And it's male dominance. Male dominance is exerted in this society, as in many other so-called traditional societies. Absolutely. Now, let's see, what else? Okay, I don't want to stay too long on the TIV today because I want to get to the stuff about language. But let's see. So keep that in mind. The third aspect. Oh, by the way, this little slide here, TIV kinship. Think of it this way. One of the things about a group like the TIV, a traditional group like the TIV with this kind of lineal system of kin, that's serving as the major organizing principle of your society. It tells you largely your placement in a kinship group traditionally in a rural agricultural area is going to tell you where you're going to live and what you're going to do when you grow up, right? You're going to get a plot of land as kind of like your family inheritance by being a member of this kinship group. You're going to live in this area. Who you're going to marry, who you're going to owe certain kinds of obligations.
you know, in marriage ceremonies, in funeral rites, and other kinds of things like that. So imagine you're a person, a Tiv person with a not untypical Tiv name, Mbakev. Okay. In your mind, kinship, this kinship relationship, set of relationships is so important that you actually contain in your head a genealogical chart that goes back many generations further than our genealogical kinship chart goes. Like myself, I can name you my parents, my grandparents, and I'm already starting to falter when it comes to my great grandparents. Okay. I mean, I'm not even sure I can do it, guys, honestly. Beyond that, not a chance, right? And sideways too, right? I've got my cousins down, but any further to the side than that, yeah, I'm not going to be able to do it. I'd have to go and do the research. The Tiv, because kinship is so important to them, since it's the organizing principle of their lives, they could name, you know, at the extreme, they could go back like 12 generations. But they probably, I think the deal is they have like, it ranges between 5 to 7 generations is pretty typical for a group like this. 5 to 7 generations back of forebears. And the way the story goes is once upon a time, there was some guy whose name was Tiv. And so the story is that we call ourselves a Tiv because the original father of us all, whoever the wife happened to be, was named Tiv. Now you'll notice that what the Bohannans pointed out is that there was a modification made to this kinship chart that had Tiv coming from some guy named Shor and somebody else who was a brother of Batule, both of whom came from this guy named Adam, right? And I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, Mbakev, Mbagor, Mbanyam, and so on. And then there's this other name that sounds much more familiar to you. So you're probably guessing correctly that what this records is the influence of Western missionaries. So you had Western missionaries coming down to Africa, you know, exploring the uncharted territories, meeting new groups, and then trying to find, you know, trying to convert people. The Tiv, I mentioned, kind of resisted Christianity. They didn't adopt Christianity, but when they heard about the very first male, right? Story of Genesis, you know, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and then there was God made all the creatures, and then there was Adam and Eve. And Adam was the first male, the father of us all. And the Tiv are thinking, well, everyone ultimately comes from the very first male, the very first father. Well, then Adam, if he's the first male, he must be Tiv, right? So they incorporate, and that kind of gets at the kind of logic that you're going to be reading about in this article for Wednesday. The way in which a group hearing a story, you know, coming from the outside, uses its own sets of beliefs, its own kind of local coordinates to interpret this new thing and incorporate it and make it their own. Okay, now there's a few other aspects of Tiv beliefs aside from like this myth, this belief about like, by the way, I think this guy Tiv, I feel pretty safe in saying that this ancestor, what's called kind of like what's called the apical ancestor, the apex of a triangle, the apex, the apical ancestor, Tiv, probably is nobody that's been, you know, demonstrated to have lived historically. It's probably just this myth that the group all believes in and ultimately thinks, you know, is part of their own genealogy. Now, other parts of their belief system will include what's on the following. And at this point, let me do this. Let me point out on the video lectures. So here's what the videos that I've included for everyone, they include the TIV social organization. So if what I just had to say, you know, needs repeating, that's there. And then about TIV beliefs, how they think the cosmos works. They believe in this kind of general force that's associated with what they would call, what might be called their high god, named Aondo. You know, how it operates and how they believe that that's the source of all the good or bad things that happen. Kind of like this, and associated with magic too. I need you to watch that. I'll say a little bit about it on Wednesday. I also, so this is these 1, 2, and then 3. These are all about the TIV, these first 3 videos. Okay, so they'll kind of accompany what you're going to be reading. And then there's more to say as well. We're going to be talking about I want you to watch what I call the biocultural approach. And by the way, some of the big questions to ask this time today are, what is culture? We'll be answering that question in just a second. Also, one of the questions is, so if human beings have this thing called culture, we might wonder, are we the only ones that have culture? Are we the only creatures? My answer is that we are, if you define culture in a certain kind of way, that way being culture that depends on symbolic thought. And symbolic thought, in the way that I define it, is probably something that you can only demonstrate among human beings. Now, finally, another big question would be, can human beings get by? Are we viable in the form that we possess today without this thing called culture? And this idea here, the so-called biocultural approach to the role of culture within the human species, argues that without culture, we're not workable, even biologically, neurologically. Okay, we actually require the external input of this thing we call culture to operate, as it were, appropriately, effectively. Okay, so that, and then there's some, you'll notice there's other issues as well. There's a concept called cultural lag that I've dedicated a video to. I want you to watch this video on what a guy named Alexis de Tocqueville had to say about American culture way, way back when. And then finally, this guy here, Gerhard Lenski. Gerhard Lenski, well, tell you what, I'll tell you about him on Wednesday. There's actually a separate homework assignment that you do on him. And when we talk about him, we'll be talking a little bit more about these hunter-gatherer groups and what egalitarianism may mean. So I'm glad you brought that question up, because that's a question that's going to be recurring throughout our these 8 weeks here. Okay, now I'm starting to head towards where we're going to do our exercise. I'm going to shift forward in the PowerPoint and move to, we'll talk about that on Wednesday, to this. Let me make sure everyone sees this. So culture. So what is culture? Look, there's 1,000 definitions of culture. One of the most famous, and one that's very inclusive, that pretty much includes the whole kitchen sink, as it were, is this one here. It's an old one, but it's still a good one, except for the masculinist or sexist language. It's a complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, law, custom. So all kinds of stuff, right? And then any other capabilities and habits. And I underscored this term, acquired by man, human, as a member of society. Okay, now the important thing to point out about this definition is that it's got all this kind of stuff. It's a holistic definition. That means it likes to include the whole, all the different dimensions of lived, social collective life. So things you believe in, aesthetic works, art, drawings, drawings on the body, etchings, tattooings, law, okay, right and wrong, whether notions written down or just believed in, custom, which basically just means the usual ways of doing things, whatever those things happen to be. And the important thing is this: capabilities and habits acquired, okay, by being a member of society. So what this definition emphasizes is that culture is never something that a person can acquire genetically. Okay, you can't be a TIV person. You can't believe the things a TIV person does. You can't have the kind of family system a TIV person has. You can't practice witchcraft the way they do, by thinking that that stuff is going to somehow like pop out of the genetic code, right? No, you have to learn that. Okay, so all culture is acquired during the course of your lifetime. So it's learned. If it's learned, that means it's learned from other people, which necessarily means that culture is by definition shared. It's a collective group phenomenon. And since it's learned, it's picked up by new members of society. That implies that culture has this life that persists over the generations. Now, frankly, culture is also passed from one contemporary to another. So people can pick it up from their peers. So it can be transmitted horizontally, okay, from person to person, but also vertically, generation to generation. So culture lasts. Culture precedes people who come into it, and it outlasts people who pass away from it, right? So culture seems to have this life of its own. Okay, so keep that in mind. Culture is this thing that kind of transcends individuals because it has its own life. Okay, that people come and people go. People are born and then they die, but culture itself can maintain a recognizable identity through all of that. Now, one thing to point out is that it's convenient sometimes and possible to distinguish culture between material and non-material dimensions. Okay, so if you think about the TIV, material would be their dwellings, their artworks, their little statues, their clothing, the crops they grow, all this stuff that you can feel, that's tangible, and so on. Material culture, physical artifacts. By the way, so the computers we're using, the Zoom platform we have, the coffee I'm drinking, the pen I'm using, all of this is also material culture, right? So an alien comes by and they're able to identify, the human being after a time, after doing participant observations, by these typical features of physical features of its culture. Non-material culture, okay, things like identities, ways of doing family, beliefs that we'll talk about in, when we talk about the belief in witchcraft on Wednesday. That's going to be so this stuff here that mostly seems to have what we like to call a mental life, right? It's in the head. We'll call non-material culture. And what I'd like to say about that, leading into our the discussion I want us all to have here in just a second is, now I'm gonna skip past this stuff right here, is all this stuff, at least among human beings, when we talk about culture in its non-material sense, values and beliefs and so on, all of that stuff rests on symbols. All of that stuff is carried by symbols. What are symbols? I would suggest that symbols are a kind of sign that no other animal has in the way that we have it. Okay, your book uses this term. Your book uses this definition. Anything that carries a particular meaning by persons who share a culture. So if you think about it, what does that mean? It means that, let's see, what would be an example? An example might be, well, let me go down and use this one, right? A flag. Take a flag, the flag of Nigeria, the flag of the United States, any kind of flag that stands for a country or stands for a group. You know, back in the medieval ages, it may have stood for a dynasty. So that particular flag that's made of this, you know, fabric, maybe cotton fabric, whatever it happens to be, or synthetic, whatever it happens to be, it means that thing only within a particular group of people, a particular culture that agree that it's going to have that particular meaning. Its meaning doesn't come from anything else. And here you might want to think of the difference between, let me go ahead and use the whiteboard. The way I like to put this, what's special about a symbol? Okay, and apologies, I should have mentioned that I'm going to be a little more lectury today than I have been in the past, but I need to lead up to this stuff here. Think about what's sometimes called a natural sign. There's different kinds of signs. There's natural, and then there are, let me call it arbitrary signs. A natural sign, and by the way, a natural sign is also going to be like a symbol. A symbol is going to be a kind of arbitrary sign. A natural sign is like when you see smoke. You see smoke, and where there's smoke, you can be sure, and that's going to stand for a little fire. There's a little fire, right? So you see fire and you interpret it. It's a sign that there's, you see smoke, and it's a sign that there's fire. You see, this is a track, bunny rabbit track. I don't know if bunnies got through, right? It's a track in the snow. You see a track, and this track is a sign that stands for a rabbit, let's say. So a natural sign is a kind of sign in which the sign and the thing it stands for have some kind of causal relationship between the two. The sign depends for its physical existence on the presence or action of that thing. Like, so think the track and the deer or the rabbit. Okay, without the deer or the rabbit, that track wouldn't be there. Without the fire, the smoke wouldn't be there. So not only human beings, but all other animals use signs. They interpret signs all the time. Your dog uses signs. Your dog, with its very powerful nose, right? It's picking up these chemicals, these pheromones in the air, and so it knows about the presence of other dogs or rabbits or human beings, right? Because those are signs that it interprets, okay, that depend on the individuals that are getting them off. Now take that flag, right? So you got a flag, but that's arbitrary, right? There is no, so, and it stands for, okay, there's a quick picture of the United States, right? Well, I mean, there's no way that you can say this has the same relationship to this as a fire has to smoke. It's completely arbitrary. Actually, we could get rid of this and we could just say, okay, from here on out, my little smartphone, we're all going to agree that my smartphone now stands for the United States. Or if I don't like the smartphone, take whatever you want, right? Actually, it's infinite. There is no limit to the possibility, to the number of possible things we could use to stand for something else. That's the definition of a symbol. It's anything whatsoever we decide to make stand for some other thing. We just need to agree with one another that it's going to stand for that thing. Okay. Now, it seems to be the case that only human beings have pulled off that kind of trick, where they're able to make anything whatsoever stand for another thing, as long as they agree with other people that that's what it'll stand for. Now, let me move from that. And that's very powerful. So once you have that capacity for symbolic interpretation, it seems like the sky is the limit. Language itself, think of what, and by the way, you can do this like with gestures or hand signs as well. So think about like the peace sign, right? So, well, here's Winston Churchill. Remember, he was the prime minister of Great Britain during World War II. And when he made what we see as the peace sign, it meant the V sign. It standed for the V in victory within a military campaign, which is completely the opposite of peace, right? So we can take anything and make it stand for anything else. We just got to agree.
So can you use the swastika as an example of what you're explaining?
Yes, yes. What's the deal with that?
That's a good question, considering it started as a relatively peaceful symbol.
Yeah, do you know what it stood for at first, or where it came from?
I'm not 100% sure, but I know it was either like, I think it was like a mix between medical and military. I'm not 100% sure. I just know that once Adolf Hitler got his hands on it, it completely changed.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. That is a case where now when you see a swastika, right, it means all kinds of like morbid, evil kinds of things, right? In the eyes of many, right? I actually think I learned this not very long ago. I think somebody check on this, do a Google on this. I think it may have actually begun in India. I think that's the whole Aryan kind of. Oh, I'm sorry. Was that you, Chance?
Yeah. It was.
Eurasia.
Yeah. It was prosperity and good luck.
Okay. Yeah. So I think it may have been the Indian subcontinent. And so, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Completely different place, completely different meaning. Well, look, that's all I want to point out is how different a kind of thing that is than a natural sign. And as far as we know, non-human animals seem to be confined largely to, there's probably a bunch of gray areas, especially when you get to, say, chimpanzees, where some people have been making kind of a case that they may have something quasi-symbolic going on. But I don't think you're ever going to find anything akin to what we're talking about here with swastikas, peace signs, and so on among non-human animals. Now.
So go ahead. Actually, that was a stupid question.
Sure?
I was going to ask. Go ahead. Yes.
Okay. So to get to language, so let's just start with the sounds of language. Start with say a dog. Take a dog. Well, in English it's dog, right? D-O-G. But what is it in German? Does it sound anything like dog? Not at all.
No.
It's Hund. What is it in Spanish? Sound anything like dog? Again, the answer is no. In Italian, which I happen to know, it doesn't sound anything like any of those others. So you got the four, and you could, until you get to really closely related languages, you're probably not going to find anything, similar. So that's a case. Language looks to be a case where we just take the sounds, our vocal apparatus is capable of making it. You make a string of sounds, and whatever sounds we're going to agree are going to stand for whatever we want it to stand for, and that's our language. We're going to talk a little bit more about language when we get to the part on socialization, the section on socialization. But so language is huge. Okay. Language is probably one of the most defining traits of the human being. Okay. This thing we're able to do, when we're moving our mouth or when we're using signs, if we're not, vocal, if we're not doing verbal language, is just, it's symbolic, and it's filled with all kinds of strange things that you don't find in other creatures. Now, here's what I want to do is talk about this. What's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. If you haven't heard the name before, sometimes it's called the linguistic relativity thesis. And it's basically, so why is it called this? There was a guy named Benjamin Whorf, and there was a guy named Edward Sapir, 1930s, 1940s. And you can read this a little. I've got some quotes by them here, but it's this is the idea. Okay, so human language is like one of the central media of culture, right? It's the medium or vehicle through which we communicate with each other. We even think. Yeah, I guess we think in language. And there are about 6,000. There's 6,000 plus. It depends on what you count as a language, but right now there exists in the world of languages that are spoken 6,000. Only 4,000 or only 400 years ago, by the way, there were 12,000 by some estimates. So it's shrunk by half in a very short period of time. And predictions are that you're going to see similar shrinkage as time progresses. We could have another discussion about whether we should be cheerful about that, or we should be just the opposite. But the idea is that each one of these languages, possessing its own set of unique features, unique grammar, unique sounds, will do what? And what Sapir and Whorf hypothesis say is the following. They say human beings are very much at the mercy of the particular language that's their medium of expression. What do they mean? That what we see as the real world is largely built up unconsciously on our language habits, the particular language we speak, whether it's English, whether it's Spanish, the two dominant languages in North America, or whether it's Italian, which I mentioned, or German, or whether it's Urdu in Pakistan, or whether it's Quechuan down in Ecuador, or whatever it happens to be. One of these 6,000 languages, they argue that no two languages are ever sufficiently similar to be considered as representing the same social reality. Even comparatively simple acts of perception. Perception of what? Perception of things like color and shape and movement and you name it, are more at the mercy of social patterns called words than we might suppose. So what they're suggesting there, their strong suggestion, is that the language you happen to speak shapes your reality. You're going to have a different understanding of the world, a different experience of the world if you speak English than if you speak Spanish, than if you speak Urdu, than if you speak Tagalog in the Philippines or what have you. Okay, so if you guys have taken, like, ever taken a language class, taken what, maybe we have people who are multilingual, bilingual in this class. Maybe you know Spanish, that's a common one, or French, or who knows what. Or you may have taken French or German or Spanish or what have you, and you may have heard things like the following. You may have heard it said that there's certain words that you can't translate into English. Ever heard that kind of thing before? Like, there's a certain concept. The first language I ever took was German. And there was a word in German that our German instructor wanted us to understand can't be translated into English. It was called Gemütlichkeit. Gemütlichkeit. I remember her telling us this story, and here's what she said. She said, you want to know what Gemütlichkeit means? You can't know because you can't translate it into English, but it's like in Germany, when you go to this nearby pub in a small village and meet your coworkers after a long day in the office, and you sit around and you order one of these wonderful, thick German, home-brewed German beers, and you're getting your appetizers, and you're sitting around and you're, exchanging stories with your friends. And after a while, between the beer and the friendship and the chatter and everything else, this warm glow overtakes you, and you experience Gemütlichkeit, right? A sense of warm, comfortable togetherness away from et cetera, and it's Gemütlichkeit, and you can't translate it into English. Okay, you have to be German, and you have to speak German in order to get Gemütlichkeit. Yeah, go T.
Is that like sort of the same thing? I briefly tried to learn Mandarin back in the day, and one of the hardest things that they tell you is that idioms in English do not translate in other languages very well, which is one of the hardest things, because they try to translate it exactly as it sounds. Like straight from the horse's mouth is one that they always get confused because it doesn't make any sense to them. So it's like the way that it's translated is more like they make it sound like there's an actual horse talking to you. So I'm wondering if this concept is like.
Great example. So right out of the horse's mouth. And what you're saying is like kind of like Gemütlichkeit. They're like, you just can't translate it. It won't work. You try your best, and it just ain't gonna work trying to translate it into Mandarin. It's gonna come out all weird. It's gonna have these little weird features to it. So, well, here's my question though. My question was that, so here is the idea that there's something like when you speak German, because German and not English possesses this word with this particular meaning, in order to experience Gemütlichkeit, in order to live Gemütlichkeit, you would have to be a German speaker, a native German speaker. Okay, that's kind of the idea. Also, let me, and so also in order to really understand or get straight from the horse's mouth, you can't be Mandarin Chinese. You'd have to be an English speaker. Otherwise, it just isn't going to work. You aren't going to get it. That's kind of the idea. Another example would be this. Let's take Spanish. I bet people are familiar, if not with Spanish, then with French, or maybe languages that have gender, right? We'll take a chair, for example. What is the gender of chair in English? There is none. English doesn't use gender, right? A chair is a chair is a chair. But in Italian, and I think I remember students telling me before that also in Spanish, a chair is actually feminine. A chair is female. So like the article you use or whatever, it's female, okay? And every single noun in Italian, which is the one I happen to know, is also gendered. It's going to be male or it's going to be female. And part of learning the language, part of getting the language is learning the gender so that you can get all the other things right as well. So here's what if you take this theory seriously, you might suspect, what do you think about this idea? The experience of chair for an English speaker is somehow fundamentally, perhaps subtly different from the experience of chairs in a gendered language. That somehow the chair, sitting in a chair, the making of a chair, the thinking about a chair is somehow subtly different if it's gendered than if it's no gender at all in English. Does that seem, well, I don't know what that seems like to you, but let me actually, I'm going to put you guys in groups in just a second here because I want you to think about this question. Maybe you feel some kind of way, one way or another, regarding this general question about the influence of language on thought. But one idea, so take, let's see, what do I want to do? Take that and go like that and go like that. There's two different positions that people take regarding the question of language. What is the influence of language on thought? Is it what Sapir and Whorf are talking about? And so just one example might be chair and whether or not it's gendered, right? So in Spanish and Italian, it's female. In English, it's nothing. One side may say, yeah, somehow, I don't know, having a gender for all these different things in the world may subtly influence the way in which you experience and interact with these things with a chair, right? So it must, since you're constantly talking about it in a gendered way. Or you might think that, you know what, here's a chair. That's a really lousy looking chair, but it'll do for now, right? So that's a chair. And either you call it a chair, in Italian it's called a sedia, and then there's other ones that I don't, that's the only two I know. And all these are just labels. They're handy labels that you can stick onto the thing, but the thing itself is not going to be altered by whether or not you call it a chair, a sedia, or whatever you call it. A chair is a chair is a chair. Not only that, but the thing about human beings is I've already said that they're very uniform. We pretty much have the same equipment, the same perceptual equipment, the same kind of brain. It's going to process this information about a chair. Our senses are pretty much going to be the same. We're going to feel what it's like to sit on a chair, to make a chair in precisely the same way. And then language, whatever the language is, it just gives us a particular label to stick to that thing that we all experience in the same way. Okay, so between these two positions, different people come out on different ends. And so I'm curious, I know that we're five, I'll do a couple groups. I'll put you together where you can talk yourselves about this. And what do you think? Do you think language has an effect, right? For instance, the gender, whether it's female or male, can somehow alter or influence the experience of chair. Or that's just one example. Maybe you don't like that example and you can think of other more profound examples. Okay, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you maybe 6 or 7 minutes to think about this idea about language influencing thought. Because I'm going to tell you right now that I'm going to show you some research on this. But to this very day, people are still split. People hold both these positions. Okay, so I'll just be curious to see what you all might think about this. So we only got a couple groups here. So let me go ahead. Actually, let me just recreate two assignment. Go. Let me put Britt and Chance and Aaron together, and then the other one, Holly and T. Okay, and go ahead, and I'll see you in about 5 minutes or so.
Can I ask you a question, Brett?
Yeah, T.
Are you religious?
Hmm. Um, I maybe I'll answer that. How about we'll wait till the end if you want to stick around till the end. How's that?
Well, that's fine. You were talking about religion earlier in relation to the TIV, and it sounded almost, I don't want to say biased, but it sounded like you were coming from a certain perspective. So I was curious if you considered yourself among the believers.
You know what? I'll just wait until the end to answer that one. Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
sounds good.
I'm not offended by the question or anything, but I just prefer to answer it once we're done. But it's a fair enough question. All right, let's see here. So how about Chance? Would you be what were your thoughts about this? Like, I'm kind of curious just to like people's first kind of gut reactions. Like, does this sound like, yeah, I think language affects thought, or are just like, no, we perceive things the same no matter what.
Yeah, my initial thought was language allows us to share ideas and feelings with other people. I mean, regardless of what language. And I put that it can bring society, like different diverse backgrounds together, but it could also like tear them apart.
Okay, so
With there being-
language.
just with there being a barrier of like when T said earlier, like, I could say something in English that I think would be in Spanish, but they take it literally or the wrong way.
Okay. So one of the problem or the thing about there being many different languages is that can be a source of miscommunication.
Yeah.
That okay. Yeah. So that's a related issue. I think it's another issue, but it's definitely a related one, simply because of the diversity of languages that it is interesting, right? That human beings don't simply speak language with a capital L. We speak languages, 6,000 of them. Yeah. So, yeah, and I take it that aside, you may have different languages, and that can, if you're not clear on if you haven't like sufficiently learned another language, that can lead to miscommunication. But once you get the language, now you can communicate, right? Now you can get your communication clear. And so it doesn't matter, is it kind of like whatever the language is, once you get it, you can communicate in it. So, and it's going to be about the same thing. Is that kind of it? Like,
It's not going to, like, the particular language you speak isn't going to shape your reality in a different way.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Yeah. Aaron, what's your thoughts on this?
We bounced quite a lot of different ideas. One of the things that I had brought up, and I may have been looking at this in a different, in an incorrect light, so let me go ahead and start with that. But I was kind of looking at or focusing on the male versus female, specifically in how the United States English language has evolved to where it used to be that when speaking of a group as a whole, we would take the masculine form. And that has over the years stopped to where we are more specifying the he, she, his, hers. But we've even taken it a step further recently with labeling with personal sexual orientation. And that compared to the Spanish language, from my understanding, and I could be wrong, but I don't believe that they have had as much evolution in their language over these years. And from when I learned Spanish, I know that they are still taking the masculine form when referring to the group or the whole, if a male or a man is within it, which could affect, the female identity as a whole in society of being a lesser. As one male in a group of 5, females will still take the masculine form.
Okay, so really interesting, because the way it relates to the question here is, first, we simply note that we've had changes within the, like, systematic changes within the language. So take English. In the English speaking world, take a look at the quote that I use for culture. That came from a guy from the late 1800s, right, in Great Britain, and he was talking about what is culture, all these capabilities and habits acquired by man. Right now, we wouldn't use that term. So no one would use that term now. So that has altered. And then there's the, using pronouns that have some kind of recognition of not making assumptions about sexual orientation, for one. And so that has become fairly widely circulated. And in fact, these changes, and sometimes they meet a little friction at first, but it sure seems like so far, even after they get a little friction, they start becoming pretty much just taken, for granted after a while. Why this change? I forgot I wanted to. Why this change? It seems to make the assumption that these changes have been advocated, that they've been implemented, that they've happened. Why? Because the underlying strong assumption seems to be it has an effect. It has an effect on the way it makes people think about others, right? If we use a pronoun that marks another person in a particular kind of way, that's going to affect the way we think about them, the way we behave towards them, and so on, right? So it's interesting that we're sitting here and asking, does language affect thought and, your reality and so on? And what you're pointing to is changes that have been adopted under the assumption that the answer is yes. Is that kind of what you're saying, or?
Yes, very much so.
Okay. And, to be quite honest, it's hard for me to untangle my prior assumptions that in fact is the case. I suspect it really is. I suspect that we probably have experience, many of us have experience throughout our day, in which the way in which we refer to others, the way in which we're addressed, we have direct experience daily that these things make a difference. So it could be that on one level, it's a no-brainer, right? Obviously, language must make a difference. Otherwise, why are we so concerned with how it's used? Right? Yeah, that seems right to me. However, then it's like the things that you're talking about, I wonder now if we need to be careful about picking and choosing our places. Maybe when it comes to things like chairs, the furniture of our lives, that's another case apart from these other kinds of things.
Well, and I think it kind of goes into the same to an extent, like the chair, for example, having the female, the female reference. I mean, what does a chair do? It supports whoever is sitting on it. Now, it is not
Right.
exemplary, but it is a support. And in the family dynamic for years, the woman was the support to the husband. She was not the head of the house. She was not of higher importance, but she was that support. She was needed just as much as a chair is needed to be able to rest upon for that support.
I'm trying to think of.
I might be stretching too far, but
no. If a person was going to go in that direction and seek ways in which interpretations that supported that view, that's definitely one of them. I was thinking, now my mind is going to other items. I know a house in Italian is also female, right? That could be seen as a support system. I mean, I could think of other, like a carpet, which, everyone, and that happens to be male. Good. How about, let's go to, let's see, Holly and T. Why don't I go to T? Did you guys have any thoughts on this? Feel one way or another?
It was a little difficult, I'm not gonna lie. I don't know if part of the explanation that I've come up with will explain this at all. But I pointed out that with the English language, as much as anyone can say at one point in one sentence, most of our words come from the Latin language. So I was curious to see if possibly the reason why inanimate objects were assigned a certain gender is possibly because, like I used the word bio as an example, which means life in Latin. And any way you use it, bio was going to mean life, which means that we had to come up with ways to differentiate it, which was like, I use biochemistry as an example. I know that's not specifically what I'm talking about, but we had to assign it a certain type of bio, if that makes sense. So with, I don't know how other languages started out like that. So I was wondering if the reason it's male or female is not necessarily inherently because that matters, more so because they have a lot of words that come from the same root that they had to connotate differently so that they would come out differently and mean different things. But that also could be just complete and utter crap. I don't really know. Like I said, I was extremely confused.
Can I say something?
Yeah,
Yes.
Britt.
So I actually kind of talked about this in our group, but like most of the languages over in Europe are the love languages, and all of those are based off of Latin. So like going off of what T was saying, yes, most of like our words have a gender, but we've kind of dropped that, I feel like, because some of our words do come from Latin, just like what the Romance languages, they're all based off of Latin. So they all have like gender association and like assigned like genders. So yeah, you're not wrong, T. Just gonna say that.
Well, thank you. I feel a little better.
Welcome.
Yeah. So the Italian, the French, the Spanish, the Romanian, those ones. So they branch off of Latin. So they're all going to have gender now. So the deal with English is it doesn't have gender, right? Because essentially English, it's got lots and lots of Latin, tons of Latin, right? But it's a Germanic, and it's Germanic. Now German has gender, but English does not. Yeah, so as to, why English doesn't have gender, I actually don't know. I don't know, like historical linguists. So now the question here, the real question is, does English not having say, pick some element of the language, whether it has, and gender, the gender system is just one among many, many different ingredients in a language. Oh, there's other parts of it, it's like grammar system and so on. We'll see another one in just a little bit. And the question is whether, does having a gender system change your thought, change the way you perceive or experience the world, okay, versus having one? Does having one or not having one affect how you experience the world and maybe even how you behave? I don't know, Britt, what do you think about that? Does that seem crazy to you that it would affect how you behave and see the world and behave? Or does it seem reasonable?
I feel like it kind of depends on like where you grow up. I mean, for like people that grow up in America, I feel like you don't really think about objects as having gender. That hasn't really been a thing that's been like expressed or anything.
Okay, so here you and me, we're using English. We never talk about like a bottle of water. It doesn't have a gender, right? Phone doesn't have a gender. Zoom, so no. But do you think that if you were speaking a language where you were referring, where these objects had a gender, that would, I don't know, affect your experience of the water bottle or the phone?
I don't think so. I feel like it has more to do with being able to have the language have a more flow to it rather than have an effect on the way you perceive the object.
Okay, so it's kind of like, whatever language you're using, the language itself may have little different features, but a bottle of water is a bottle of water is a bottle of water. Right? Whatever language you use. Okay. Let's see. How about
I have a
Holly?
question.
Yeah.
Never mind. Go to
Are you
Holly.
sure?
She was in my group. Yeah.
Holly, did you have any thoughts one way or another?
It was really hard for me to even think that there would be a difference, just because obviously, where I grew up, it's hard to imagine that making a difference. So it's kind of hard to take a stance one way or the other.
Is it because, is it kind of like this? I wonder if Britt wasn't getting at this too, that like, look, so here, I know for myself, I've spent most of my time here in the United States, and it's pretty much, I spend almost all my time in the United States speaking English. So I'm just not in contact very much with other languages. So it doesn't even occur to me that like, a language would make a difference in how I thought about the world. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, it's just hard for me to think that assigning gender to something would make you look at it differently.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. So this particular little piece of language, how can that fundamentally, like, what is it going to do? Is it going to enter into your, visual system in the brain and like change your experience of a chair just because the chair has a gender assignment? Probably not, is what you're thinking. Yeah. So in that position, that's a strong position that many people hold to this very day. So let me do this now. I don't know if there were further questions about this, but so other people from as soon as this Sapir and Whorf, these two guys brought up this idea, made those statements. People were like, okay, maybe languages can differ so much. And since we use them so often, we're talking all the time. And it often feels like we're using language when we think to ourselves. Maybe it gets in there, the language gets in there and has some kind of effect on us. Okay, but how could you prove that? How could you even demonstrate that that's the case? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you one attempt to do that. So here's what you're looking at right here. And if you're not seeing it, tell me. But back in the 1950s, there were two researchers, a guy named Carroll, a guy named Casagrande. That's their last names. They had access to people on this big Native American reservation down in Nevada, Navajo, largest Native American group to this day. And here's what they and here was the deal. They had access to two different groups that they were going to compare. One group was speaking almost all English. Okay, they were kids, they were going to school, and the school was conducted in English, dominant English. There's a whole other story about that, okay, that is not uninteresting at all. But for our purposes, all we need to know is they were mostly speaking English. They had lost most of their Navajo. Okay, there was another group that was mostly speaking Navajo. Okay, so there was a Navajo dominant group of kids and an English dominant group of kids. And here's what we know about Navajo. So the important thing to know about Navajo is not a gender system, but a different kind of system, a system of affixes. Affixes are little bits that you can put on a word to change its meaning a little bit. So here's an example. Take the word nation, and then I can change it. I can say national, right? Now it's an adjective. I could put on something else. I could say pre-national. A pre-national identity, for example, would be an identity before any nation existed, right? So those are affixes, a prefix, a suffix at the end. Some languages have affixes that you put, it turns out, in the interior of a word, called infixes. Regardless, the thing about Navajo is it had a really rich, a big affix system, much richer than English. So English uses suffixes, affixes, but not to the same extent that Navajo does. So here's just one little taste of their suffix system. They could take a root word like the word san, and they could put on different suffixes, sanle, sanli, sanikus. I'm surely not pronouncing that correctly. And what that does is just by putting on this little suffix, you suddenly change information regarding things like texture, shape, form, contour. Okay, all these things having to do basically with form. Okay, the same thing with this root word. You just put on slightly different suffixes, and you can communicate very quickly all kinds of information about the shape of something, its textural quality, and so on and so forth. Okay, and here's the idea. The idea, if you're thinking Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, you're like, could that affect the way in which a Navajo person experiences the world or thinks or behaves in a way that differentiates them from an English speaker? And the idea was this. one way in which they think about these things is they think in terms of what's called salience or importance. Salience is like importance or priority. If something has salience, it sticks out, it jumps at you. So it could be that if you have a language that's really good, has a good mechanism for communicating all kinds of fine detail about contour and form and texture and so on, that stuff is going to stick out in your mind much more and much more quickly than not. Okay, so that's Navajo. What about English? English, for its part, is different from Navajo in possessing a lot more color terms. Now, I actually don't know how many color terms Navajo has, but English has, like many large-scale industrial societies, English has hundreds, thousands of color terms. The ones we use a lot every day are maybe like a dozen of them: yellow, blue, orange, red, green, violet, and so on, right? But it has a lot more than Navajo. So here was the thought. Okay, here's how this worked. They set up an experiment, and it went like this. If you're a Navajo speaker and you're Navajo dominant, you're mostly speaking Navajo, what they do is they take you and they put you at some kind of table. So you're the subject of this experiment. And now what they're going to have is here they got a stick, they got a rope and a rope. They got three things. And what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to do what goes with what belongs with what two things are most alike, right? So what you're doing is you're doing a membership category exercise. What belongs with each other, what doesn't belong. Okay, and here's your prediction. You say a Navajo speaker, if they have that suffix system, the thing that's salient is texture, form, contour. It's not color. So if you have two things, and here what you have in this, say the first set of things is a blue stick, a yellow rope, and a blue rope, the idea is that your language is going to make you focus on its stickness or its ropeness, not its color. So what you're going to do is the prediction is the Navajo dominant speaker will put rope with rope. And then if it has a blue rope, a yellow stick, and a yellow rope, again, it'll bypass color, it'll put rope with rope. And then cylinder with cylinder, stick with stick, and so on. And then the prediction is the English speaker, because color is relatively dominant, or it has a rich color system rather than a rich contour communicating suffix system, it's going to put color with color. It's going to put blue stick and blue rope together. So that was the prediction. So just think about what this is saying. The experiment is basically predicting that these little features, whether or not it has a rich color vocabulary or whether or not it's got this suffix system aimed at form, is actually going to influence your thought and your behavior in deciding what belongs with what. Okay, and that's a crucial kind of operation, right? Human beings play that game, as it were, with all kinds of things. They play it with inanimate things. What rocks are alike? What snakes are alike? What liquids are alike? What people are alike? And you name it, right? So we categorize and we put things in boxes. And what if your language can influence that? Okay, so and very quickly, to jump very quickly to the conclusion, it went like this. In this first round of experiment, they had support for their hypothesis. So 70% of the Navajo dominated kids, the Navajo dominant kids, they selected what was predicted. 70% of the kids speaking mostly Navajo put rope with rope, put stick with stick, cylinder with cylinder. And less than half of the English dominant kids did the same thing. Okay, so most of the English dominant used color most of the time to group things. However, okay, so at first, Carroll and Casagrande are like, our experiment strongly supports the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that language can make this big difference. And it does so unconsciously, right? We're not thinking our language is going to affect like how we do group membership. It just does without our awareness. However, long story short, they had replication problems. So they were not able to get the experiment to replicate. And then what happened is, to jump through decades, there were like several decades in which other lines of research seemed to support the other story, the story that, and this was especially with color terms. There was research that was done on like cross-cultural color perception, making judgments about what colors are most alike and so forth. And that seemed to suggest that language didn't have much of an effect, that we all see colors in more or less the same way. However, within the last couple decades, beginning in like the 1990s up through the present, there's been a new round of research. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly show you, and this will finish up for today. This will be the last thing where I'm going to show you research. So a woman named Lera Boroditsky has been, and she comes out of psychology, but influenced by a lot of people who like come before her working on this kind of stuff. And she's done and collected a lot of research over the last few years suggesting that language has a number of sometimes very subtle effects on people's perception. For example, let me show you this one really quick. I was just looking at this morning. I finally tracked down this article that I heard about for a long time. So you see these three squares here, and they're all blue. It's another matching exercise. What you're supposed to do is you're supposed to decide, of the bottom two, these two right here, which one most closely matches this. What do you guys think? Think it's the one on the left or the one on the right is closest to the top one?
Left.
Yeah. Okay. And so we all get that, right? We look at it and we're like, yeah, I've looked at it a few times and I'm pretty sure it's that. And that's right. Now, it turns out if I took T and Holly and Chance and Britt and Aaron and myself, and we all did this, we would make that answer more slowly than if we were native Russian speakers. If we are native Russian speakers, we have two terms, and the two terms are, I can't remember which is which, but it's I don't know how to pronounce these either. Guloboy and Sini, something like that. And one of them means light blue and the other means dark blue. Now in English, as a primary color term, we just have blue. Now, the question these guys did was, is it going to make a difference in response time? They wanted to make sure that they would pick something that everyone will get, okay? But if we have one language, English in this case, where you just have blue, that's the primary color term everyone learns. I mean, we have other, like we have azure and stuff like that, but nobody ever uses that. But in Russian, these two terms for light blue and dark blue are used as frequently as blue is in English. Is this going to make a difference? If you have these two terms as part of your everyday common color terms, is that going to have any kind of effect whatsoever on your perceptual capabilities of distinguishing these two blues? And what they found out is, on average, over and over again, the response time is less. Okay, you answer it more quickly if you have Cine and Gulaboy rather than just blue. Okay, so the idea there is that, you know, that's one small piece of research that of the kind that's been used. Here's another one. I'm going to show, the last thing I'm going to show you is this one. But here's the deal. My big question about this one, I have a problem with this research. I want to see if you can get the problem too. My question is, does it actually address the question about language it claims to address? Or is it, or are its results actually about something other than language itself? Here's the research. So there's a group called the Kuuk-Thaayorre. They're a very small group. Where are they located? Here they are. A very small group. That, in fact, right now that says 200. That means there are 200 living speakers of an Australian language called Kuuk-Thaayorre. What that means is that unless something is done, Kuuk-Thaayorre isn't going to be around for much longer. Here's the deal with Kuuk-Thaayorre. Kuuk-Thaayorre, what they did is they did an experiment, and the experiment was a navigation experiment. What you do is you plop people down onto terrain that's unknown to them, unfamiliar to them. You plop them down and they have to find their way out, something like that, something like a labyrinth or maze or something else. And the different subjects that are going to be doing this performance exercise, half of the subjects are going to be English speakers, half of the subjects are going to be Kuuk-Thaayorre. Okay. How are their languages different? Okay, here's what Lera Boroditsky says. She says the Kuuk-Thaayorre language is a language that obligates, demands that their speakers use cardinal direction. What is cardinal direction? Cardinal direction is like compass direction. So what's special about compass direction? What's special about compass direction is if you're holding a compass, if you turn around, the needle's going to change so that it always points north, right? So in other words, also similar to that, other compass-like kind of landmarks would or points of reference would be stars in the sky, like, you know, so celestial, astronomical bodies, or it could be huge, gigantic landmarks like mountains or rock formations, which are found in like the outback area of the Australian, you know, interior. So cardinal directions are basically points of reference that are observer independent. No matter which way the observer is facing or moving, they always remain the same, right? So they're always going to be a certain guide to navigating somewhere, to get it to finding correct directions. And Cook Thayor, here's the deal with Cook Thayor. It's part of the custom of the group to, when you meet each other and when you depart, to greet each other by always saying the direction, the compass direction that you're coming from or going to, right? So I meet you, we greet each other, and I have to tell you, I'm coming from the south-southwest, and I'm heading, the north-northeast, right? Or I'm heading, due east or due west, as the case may be. So we habitually do that all the time. So we're always constantly updating ourselves and communicating our cardinal direction. So we have to know compass or cardinal direction very well. English, on the other hand, and I'm a typical English speaker in this respect, I do not know cardinal direction, right? So if we're sitting at the table together and you ask me to hand me the bowl to my northeast, I'm not going to be able to do it. Or, I have no idea where the northeast is facing relative to me. If you ask me to hand you the bowl to my left, that I can do, right? Because I know where my left is relative to myself. So ordinal direction, what's ordinal direction? It's like left or right, front or back, top or bottom, right? That changes whichever way I change, right? So right now, my left is on your right, right? If I turn around, and vice versa. If I reorient, that changes where my left is. It changes where my front is. Okay, so in finding your way out of unknown territory, we don't use left or right. That's why we bring a compass, right? So the prediction was this. The prediction was, if you put English speakers and Cook Thayor speakers in some kind of experiment where they need to use landmarks, compass direction to find their way out of a place, is Cook Thayor or English. Okay, so the idea was this performance experiment would indicate the results, or the outcomes of this experiment might indicate the effect of language on navigation, on a sense of orientation. And in fact, here's what happened. On average, the Cook Thayor were able to navigate, find their way out much more often, much more quickly than English speakers were. Okay, so on average, the Cook Thayor outcompeted the English speakers in these navigation experiments. And what Lera Boroditsky did is she concluded that therefore this demonstrates that, or gives support for the idea that the Cook Thayor language influences one's perception of reality, or influences cognition. In this case, your ability to have an accurate awareness on cardinal direction. Now, I don't know if anybody else is feeling the way I feel about this experiment, but I say it's a good experiment if the purpose of the experiment was to demonstrate that the Cook Thayor are better on average, okay, than the English speakers at finding their way in unknown terrain, I think, yeah, it demonstrated that. But I'm not sure that it was talking about language. Does anybody know why I have that doubt?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so here's what Lyra Boroditsky is saying. Look, the Cook Thayor, these guys from Australia, they find their way. They're better navigators than you and I are. Unless I mean, it could be that you guys are actually pretty good. Maybe you're good with a compass and finding your way out. But if you're anything like me, if you plot me and a Cook Thayor person down in strange territory, they're going to find their way. If you give them directions, they're going to find their way out better and quicker than I would. Okay. However, what I'm saying is I don't think that that tells us about their language. Lyra Boroditsky is saying it tells us about their language. Do you see why I'm saying that? Any guesses as to why I'm suggesting that? Because she's claiming that it tells them about Cook Thayor language, that there's something about the difference between Cook Thayor and English. No, okay, fair enough, fair enough. I've kind of kept you guys on around for a while here, so, and maybe I didn't make the question very clear. But let me just, so I do want you to be aware of this because it's a kind of a general point about the interpretations of experiments, maybe experimental designs as well. This is part of why the social sciences are difficult, okay? Trying to isolate the variable that you're interested in. So let me put it this way. So I want you to be aware, first of all, what did her experiment show? These Australian guys, the Cook Thayor, they perform better. They found their way out, okay, better than you or I would. So if they plopped you down in the middle of Yellowstone, and they said, you know, the way to the store is you know, northeast, the Cook Thayor would find their way there better than, you know, and there were 10 of them, and there were 10 English speakers, say, plucked from society in general. On average, the Cook Thayor are going to outperform in navigating better than English speakers would.
Does that have anything? No, never. I'm confused.
No. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Let you. I'm just
No.
confused. Like, I must have missed something. I think I might have missed something. I don't understand like the correlation of this specific example that you're using to the topic of like language, but I get what you're tying into. So
because here's why. Let me go back again. Here's what she says about in English, we only use ordinal direction. We mostly use ordinal direction. What we do is we say, could you hand me that to my left? I'm heading to my right. That our language only provides us things like left, right, front, back, up, down. And
gotcha.
These are directions that change if we change, right? Your left is going to change depending on if you're turning one way or another, right? And front and back too.
The view of what it is that you're looking at will change, but your left will always be your left, just like north will always be north, no matter what way you're facing.
Absolutely, absolutely. So in other words, left and right is not a good way to give directions to people. Say, I don't know, if you're traveling to, I don't know, from whatever, Louisiana to Anchorage, Alaska. You probably, so cardinal directions are going to remain the same. Okay, they're not going to change depending on whether or not you turn one way or another. And if you have a compass, right, when you change, the needle on the compass changes so that it's always facing in the same direction, right? So in fact, what you just said, the fact that your left is always your left, okay? However, your left changes, right? Your left is actually facing, so
So
think
it's
of
not
it-
necessarily the directions of left and right. It's the perspective of the person
Yes.
that's actually talking.
absolutely. So that's what this means. This ordinal means it's observer dependent. It's the perspective. The perspective is tied, okay, to left, right, up, down, front, back. But northeast is always northeast, no matter which way you're facing. Does that make sense if I say that? Like
Yes.
the northeast is always the northeast on, you know, on the earth, whether or not you're facing it or you turn your back to it. The needle is always going to be pointing in the same direction. Right? So and so the Cook Thayor, they use cardinal direction. That's cardinal direction. Doesn't matter. It's like compass. It's always going to be pointing in the same direction. Okay. And the Cook Thayor are their language. Boroditsky is saying that their language obligates them to use cardinal direction. So they're always saying something translatable into English within Cook Thayor as northeast, northeast, and so on, right? So they're going to have a more accurate view of the landscape and be able to navigate their way, you know, to a particular coordinate more easily than English. That's the idea. Okay, now here's what she's saying. She's saying that it's the language. She's saying that Cook Thayor, since it forces people to greet each other talking about the compass direction, the cardinal direction that they're coming from and that they're going to. They're always talking about it. So they're always aware of it. It's as though you were aware at all times what your compass direction is. So that if you've got a pen in front of you, or you've got a pen, you know, in your room, you could tell me whether that pen is to the, you know, is south of you, southwest, northeast, or what have you. I can't. There's a pen to the right of me, and I have no idea which direction that pen is facing in terms of compass direction. But the idea is that the Cook Thayor could, because their language is always forcing them to talk about compass direction. Okay, now what I'm saying, my doubt is this. My doubt is that this is actually telling us that the language is responsible for the Cook Thayor knowing direction better than the English speakers. What I think is being done here is that it's simply the culture in the most general sense, right? That's doing this. It's important for the Cook Thayor, especially traditionally, right? No GPS systems, no maps. Okay, when they were a traditional hunter and gatherer society, they simply had to use things like stars, landscapes, and other things to have a good idea of how to get around from place to place, especially if they're walking a lot of distance. So they actually got really good at using those kinds of tools, using the constellations, the landmarks, and so forth. And I don't think that that has to depend on whether or not you're speaking Cook Thayor or English. So it's like this. I could get all of us. We could decide in this class, we're going to get really, really good at compass directions over the next 8 weeks. We're just going to decide that that's going to be our deal. And we're going to do it in English because we don't speak Cook Thayor, we speak English. So because we have this little mini culture of 6 people and we all decide it's going to be really, really important for us to do this. We want to get this skill under our belt. And so we get really good at reading a compass or using constellations or using landmarks. And suddenly we're able to tell each other where that bottle of water is, where the refrigerator is it to the south or the southeast, and so on. But it doesn't depend on English, is my point. We could do it in English or we could do it in Kuuk Thaayorre, but the important thing is whether or not we develop these skills and habits because it's important within our culture. So in other words, here's my, just as a kind of takeaway, if I were to write something down, and maybe if it's not clear right now, if you revisit this idea that I think, here's my, the criticism or the, let's say, critique of the Boroditsky experiment is she doesn't actually isolate the independent variable that she thinks she does, right? So an independent variable is the thing you think is responsible for causing change in the dependent variable. The dependent variable is the performance in this direction task, finding your way to some destination. Okay, she says the independent variable is the language. She says it's either English or Kuuk Thaayorre. If you got English, you're probably gonna perform worse. If you got Kuuk Thaayorre, you're probably gonna perform better. And I say it's not the language itself. Rather, it's the culture in general. It's whether or not a group thinks it's important to develop these navigational skills with cardinal direction. And then it could either be in Kuuk Thaayorre or in English. Okay, so I don't think it's or I have my doubts. Let me put it that way. I have my doubts that language is actually what's responsible for the performance of the Kuuk Thaayorre. Rather, I think it's their culture, and they just happen to speak Kuuk Thaayorre. Have I completely confused everyone? Or does that seem a little clear, maybe? Maybe. Okay.
I'm definitely gonna have to rewatch this recording, I think,
Okay.
so I can.
Yeah, do so. And think about, this issue of like, yeah, I mean, maybe it's the whole, what's the difference between cardinal and ordinal direction? And I'm not sure I have a better way of getting across the idea than that of like, think about if you have a compass in your hand. If you rotate, if you turn around in one place, the needle's gonna change. It's gonna change because it's always pointing in the same direction, whereas you're always pointing in a different direction. Your left will always be your left, but it's your left, right? So it depends on your perspective. And if you really want to find your way around unfamiliar territory, unknown territory, you need compass or cardinal direction. And the idea is that the Kuuk Thaayorre have that. For some, they've become really good at compass direction, more so than your average English speaker. Okay, guys, tell you what, I will let that go. We've gone actually longer than I was thinking we would today. Let's see here. So on Tuesday then, we are going to pick up, I want to discuss the article on the TIV.
Wednesday, you mean, right?
I'm sorry. Yeah, Wednesday, exactly. Yep.
Got me scared.
Did I say tomorrow?
You did, and I was like, is there
Yeah.
some sort of special class
Right.
tomorrow that I wasn't aware of?
I'm sorry. I'm just, yeah, no. Brains
I-
are running out of gas here, so I'm saying the wrong things. Yeah, so good. And so we got that article, and then we'll have 2 different breakout room exercises to do. So if there's any questions between now and then, I'll probably go ahead and send a follow-up email detailing, what you need to do between now and when we see each other again on Wednesday. Okay. So, all right, guys. If you don't have any other questions, I'll free to go, and I will see you on Wednesday.
Thank you, Brett.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.